Today we talk about one of my favorite portrait composites. Let's dive in. This is Behind the Shot. Hi, welcome to Behind the Shot. I'm Steve Brazill. This is the show where we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind one of their shots, from conception to completion and all those choices that they make in between. As always, there is a blog post for this episode. You can find it up at the website. It's at behindtheshot.tv. Of course, any links that we mention, there's a small sample gallery of their work there as well. So again, just head up to behindtheshot.tv. Also, all the links that we mention are in the description on YouTube, right down below the like and subscribe buttons. I want to get into today's show really quick. And the reason is, the shot that we're going to talk about today, which we'll get to later in the show, is one of my favorite portrait composites. I'll explain why as we go through. First of all, I'd like to welcome to the show portrait photographer Paul Mobley. Paul, how are you?
I'm great, Steve. Thanks for having me.
It is absolutely my pleasure. We've been working on getting this show together for a while. I'm excited to finally have you here. And I like to start with a little getting to know my guest section. And I explained to you in the green room, part of my reasoning that I always do this is because we're about to dissect what I think is a fantastic shot. And I want people to understand why they should listen to the person that's in front of me. And I want to start here. I introduced you as a portrait photographer. But the truth is, you're way more than a portrait photographer. And even there, you're not your typical portrait photographer. You are a sought-after corporate and advertising and editorial photographer. When you meet somebody, we were talking in the green room about Curb Your Enthusiasm. When you meet somebody at a cocktail party and they say to you, Paul, what do you do? How do you describe what you do?
I normally tell people that I am a entertainment advertising photographer. And they'll usually say, what does that mean? And then, I usually direct them to my website or say I take pictures of people that interest me for various entertainment clients.
Yeah, that's a good summary. Now, you say entertainment clients, though, which does kind of lead into this point, which is, this is going to be probably a stronger term than it should be. You seem to specialize in celebrities. That is such a unique niche, right? My friend Ian Spanier does that as well. But was that something, as you were doing your photography and getting started and building up your clientele and getting to the level that you're at, was that an area you aimed at, or did it just happen, or?
Not at all. I started actually as a fashion photographer. As soon as I started my career, I went to New York, did the Starving Artist Apprentice thing, and then really was looking for anybody who would hire me. And the first job that I actually got was a catalog similar to Macy's, and it was for shooting lots of fashion. But as I've spoken about many times, kind of the reason I got into photography was because of Irving Penn. I had admired his work from the very, very beginning when I was in college, going to school for photography, and really wanted to be him. And so in my mind, I always wanted to shoot portraits of people that interested me, and whether they were young, old, famous, not famous. And, when you start out, you have to pay the bills. So you almost take anything, to put food on the table and pay the rent, and, hope that you can continue to work towards what you really want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny. I was looking through your website. Before I have a guest on, I always go through their website kind of in detail. I was looking through your website and I saw something on your about page that was intriguing to me. There's a quote in there that says that you like visiting Michigan to eat your mother's Italian cooking. Where in Michigan?
I grew up right outside of Detroit, and my mother, God bless her, who's 92 years old, is still there. I come from a strong Italian family, and there's nobody better than, we kind of have a ranking. My grandmother was the best cook. She passed, and now it's my mom, and so on and so forth. But nobody cooks better than my mom.
I spent 3 years in Detroit. I've been in radio for 43 years. I was at WCZY in Detroit with Dick Burton, if you know who Dick Burton is.
I do.
Depending on what years you were in Detroit, my ex-brother-in-law was Robin Seymour, who was well known in the 60s and 50s and 60s in radio and television there. And just went back last year before, because we hadn't been for a while, and still love that town.
Yeah, it's great. So many good friends there, and I'm so happy that it's kind of, the rebirth and the football, and it's all good. I'm really, really
the new
happy.
Stadium down there too, Little Caesars Arena, I should say, is fantastic. We went and saw a hockey game while we were there. So there's a point during shows where I usually list some example clients that my guest has had. And here's the problem. I looked through your website and I wouldn't even know where to start with you. It seems as though you have worked with, the best way to describe your client list is it seems that you've worked for almost every A-list celebrity, musician, and corporate client that there is. Seriously, the list on your site is insane. I'm kind of curious, without naming names, have you ever had that, amazing client that you just went, okay, that's the best client I've ever had?
There's been a few in my career. I always call it the lucky breaks along the way, where you were at the right place at the right time. But I've always been of the mindset that go to the ends of the earth for your client, and do the same with your subject and your crew, and good things will come from it. So I have really, people ask me all the time, do you have any horror stories about anybody that was awful when you photographed them? And I try really hard, Steve, not to let it get that way. I don't come into any shoot with an ego. I just try to be as kind and courteous, and I know I've got to get the picture, and whatever it takes for me to get that picture is what my my goal is. And being kind and considerate to everybody is just the way it works for me.
And such a great outlook. And the funny thing was, one of my questions was going to be, and I'm not going to ask it now, was going to be, has there been a nightmare story, again, without naming somebody, that you could share that people could learn from? But I kind of like leaving it at your attitude of, it's, to a point at least, in your control, and you choose to approach it in a way to not let it get there.
I have had some tough shoots. Let me say that to you. When you're working with especially A-list people, whether they're
right,
musicians or comedians or politicians, sports figures, whatever it may be. But again, I've always kind of come from this kill them with kindness. And if they're still going to be difficult, then I just do the very best I can to get that picture. I went to a college in Detroit where I had an old cranky professor that really taught us all that, no matter what it takes, you've got to bring home the picture. And if things can go wrong, they will. And so what? If a light goes down, what are you going to do? You just find a way. And that's kind of always been my mantra is I don't worry so much about the equipment as much anymore. I'm more worried about bringing home the picture, especially if I have a subject that I haven't met or I haven't talked to. And, you don't know in many times what you're walking into. So.
Yeah. And again, dealing with the type of clientele, the A-list celebrities and musicians, and I deal with, some musicians on my end. It's amazing the different personalities, the different, I try and explain to people, everybody has a vision of themselves. And sometimes that just the vision, not even the person, their vision of themselves is more compatible with what you intend to do than what you had planned. And you've got to work around that. We're problem solvers to that point. Where did you go to school in Detroit? What was the college?
It was called Center for Creative Studies. It's still there. Now they've changed the name to College for Creative Studies, but it's a really wonderful art school right in downtown Detroit. And some great people have come out of there, fashion designers. It's been there a long time. Great school.
So in researching you, there's a couple of things that jumped out at me. One of them is you're an author, you've published 4 books. And that's always an area to me. I know a lot of photographers that do books. I got a bunch of them on the shelf here behind me. But it's always interesting to me because I think it says a lot about a photographer, about a creative, that if they're going to publish books, what they choose to publish them on. And you've got 4 different books. American Farmer, The Heart of Our Country, which is the one here in the upper left corner. If I Live to Be 100, The Wisdom of Centenarians.
Centenarians, you got it right.
Yeah, which is, I think that subject matter also is just so cool. I love that you did that. American Firefighters, which really goes well with the American Farmers idea. And then this one also, Everyday Heroes, 50 Americans Changing the World, one nonprofit at a time. I think collectively, the titles and subject matters of these books are fascinating in that I see them as kind of a window into what you shoot and what I see in your portfolio. Do you think that your subject choices here, do you see the connection there to what you shoot? And I'm curious, what draws you to making books?
Well, yes, the answer is yes. People are people. And to me, a great portrait, which we'll get into, I'm sure, has nothing to do with the equipment. For me, I've tried to distance myself from the equipment and really focus on, I have this term that, I try to find the soul of my subject. And whether that is talking to them or whether that is, trying to notice things they do in between the pictures, Steve, I find people to be fascinating. My father was a great storyteller and loved to tell us stories when we were growing up. And so in college, I was never interested in photographing cars or photographing still lives or food. It was always a people thing to me because I'm curious. I'm curious about how people live their lives and what they do to get through the day and what inspires them. And so in many ways, the celebrities, the entertainment world has interesting people, but I'll tell you, when you sit and talk with a 117-year-old woman, there's some great. I feel very, very blessed that I've been able to be around people that not only change the world but inspire. And I have a story for every picture I've taken, and it's really changed me as a human being to be around, whether it's a farmer who's really shy about having their picture taken or somebody who has their picture taken every day. It's always a challenge for me, never a dull moment for sure.
You said something, you actually said something to the effect of, I'm sure we'll get into it, but I don't focus on the gear. I focus on delivering the picture and what makes a picture.
Sure.
And I do like to ask this question of every guest, and you led right into it. And that is, what does make a great photo? Or a better way to word it is, what makes a great photo great?
Well, to me, everybody has a different opinion, but the age-old expression that I want a picture to move me. I want to look at it and stop and have to look at it again. I don't know if it was Penn or Avedon, but somebody said some of the greatest photos that were ever made are the ones that leave us with unanswered questions. We want to know more. What a great line, right? So I've always felt when I'm making a picture, I want it to last. I want somebody to look at an image and say, wow, I remember that picture that Paul took of so-and-so because it was such a moment, a powerful moment. And so I think it's got to stop you. And you've got to think about if it stirs you up in some way, whether it's the look in their eyes or their expression or their shoulder position. To me, I always know when I'm doing my editing, I feel like what is a picture that just shows me as an artist? Because there's certain pictures that people look at it and I'll say, oh, that's great. But for me, I've gotten to a point after doing this, I know what I feel like what I want it to be. But I think it's got to move you. It's got to stir you up emotionally. And to me, if we do that, it's great. We did a good job.
And it's interesting because that's kind of the argument that equipment, I don't want to say doesn't matter, but that it's about the photo, not the equipment. I'm old enough to have grown up shooting film cameras, and not as a photographer. Wasn't a photographer. It was my life. I grew up at a time when digital didn't exist, and so I shot film cameras. And I tell people all the time, the most iconic images of my life are noisy as hell. And yet today we're all complaining about, noise at 6400 ISO, which is nothing compared to what the most iconic images of my life have. The most iconic images of my life were shot with no autofocus, with, 32, maybe 16 shots in the camera.
Yeah.
And these people got images that nobody looks at and sees flaws. People look at and find magic in these images. And now we have the added benefit of that gear. I'm not saying don't use the gear, but I kind of love that idea that you discuss, and that is that it's got to move you. As I look through your portfolio, I do this with every guest. I look for common themes in their website. And for you, actually, you know what? Before I say what I see, I'm curious. If you think back on your body of work, do you see any common threads in your photos?
Oh, I do. And I have to tell you, just to add on to what you just spoke about, when I was very young in my career in New York, I was in that equipment phase, wanted to get all the expensive gear and had to have all the lenses. And I remember going in to see who's really become a dear friend of mine, who at the time was an art director at Vanity Fair. And he was looking at my portfolio, and I could tell he wasn't very impressed. And I said to him, he's looking at the picture, and I said, I used this camera with this lighting and that lens. And, he looked at me and he said, I'm going to give you some good advice. And I said, what? He said, I don't care what you use. He said, most people that are going to hire you do not care one bit about the equipment you used. If one picture here was taken with the most expensive equipment money could buy, and this one here was taken with a shoebox with a hole in it, this one with the shoebox moves me, stirs me up. This one is lifeless with the expensive equipment. I'm hiring the guy with the shoebox. And from that day, Steve, I just really had to wean myself off of what kind of camera, what do you need? I almost think of myself in many days like a surgeon. If I'm a good surgeon, it's my hands. All I need is my scalpel. And so for me, if something good is going on set with the relationship I have with my subject, I almost think of, hand me the camera. I just need this to record the magic that's going on between us. It's nothing more than a recording device to capture the moment that we've created, the interaction, that human connection between me and the subject. So to your point, and to anybody listening, cameras are great. What they do today is unbelievable to me. But if there's no soul and no life in that picture, I don't care if you've got, a 300 megapixel camera. I'm not going to look at it. It doesn't matter to me.
It's funny because I'm a music photographer, and the analogy I say to people sometimes is Eddie Van Halen could have walked into a pawn shop and picked up a $35 nylon string guitar and blown your mind because he was an artist. And you can get the most amazing entertainer of any generation on a stage.
Yeah.
And if the crowd is dead, they are no longer the most amazing entertainer. They feed off the energy from the crowd. And in doing what I do, there are photographers I know that for whatever reason couldn't get a media credential for a show, so they're not in the photo pit. They buy a ticket, they go up to the front of the crowd, they're allowed to bring in a point and shoot. And you know what? Some of them with that point and shoot get better pictures than some of the pros that were in the photo pit. The angle might be better, whatever. And it's the same argument today over phones. No, I'm not going to use a phone to shoot a concert professionally. But there are some times when you grab that phone and you snap a shot, and there are commercial shots that have been made on phones. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So what's the common theme that you see in your work?
I think I tend to use the word power and impact a lot because I want my pictures to be powerful. I've always kind of had that, whether I'm photographing a woman or a man. I'm kind of thinking in my mind, boy, uh, the ultimate is if they feel it's the best picture that they've ever had made of themselves, or someone will say, "Oh, Paul took that picture. I can tell." And really, that is, I think, if there was one secret sauce photographers should try to strive for, it's to get a look, right? It's to get to a point with your images where people can say, "Oh, I know who shot that," and then it's kind of like your recipe, right? And so for me, I tend to really, I don't like to do the same thing all the time, Steve, but I also want to make sure that it's my vision. I'm not a flavor of the month photographer when I see guys doing, creative, crazy gels, and then the next 6 months later, that's out.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a musician, as you said, stay true to what you love to sing and write. And hopefully, the world will come to you.
So when I look at your work, I definitely see your photographic voice, right? In all of your work, I see a thread. And what's interesting is my thread that I see in your work, and this may or may not make sense to you. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there's almost there's like a relaxed playfulness. Even in your serious shots, there's this relaxed, like I can imagine being on the set. And that's what I take away from your work is that I wish I could have been over his shoulder during the shoot, because even again, if it's, this strong, serious pose, there's something in it that strikes me as the entire shoot was relaxed and comfortable and playful. And I love that I get that from your work, including the shot that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's true. I try to, it's funny because, we've talked a little bit about comics, or we're going to talk about comics and laughter. And, I grew up in a household that liked to laugh and be happy. And, I was very blessed to work with Norman Lear, who did the foreword for my centenarian book. And, Norman and I spoke about the importance of having a daily laugh, and how he believed that having a belly laugh every day would add years to your life. And it's totally true. It's totally true.
Yeah, totally agree.
So yeah, I do like I do like to keep everything fun and happy, and it's better. It's better. I've been on a lot of sets, especially when I was assisting back in the day, where there was tension and yelling and screaming, and that just doesn't work for me as a creator to make the kind of work I want to make when that environment is like that.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. So before we get into the photo that we're going to talk about here, just a quick reminder for you. This show is first and foremost really a podcast. It's available wherever you get your podcasts, in audio only or video format. And you can find all the shows up at behindtheshot.tv. If you're watching on video, I just put the lower third up there. I'll throw it up there again for you so that you can easily find it, or actually there we go. Throw it up like that for you. Head up to behindtheshot.tv. Every episode has a blog post with it that gives you information about my guest, a small sample gallery of their work. And again, if you are watching this on YouTube, all the links and all the information is down in the description down below the like and subscribe buttons. I want to get into today's image. And I mentioned at the start of the show that this multi-shot composite of a portraits of a person is one of my favorite ones that I've seen. This is a multi-shot composite of the comedian Sebastian Maniscalco. Did I pronounce his name correct?
Sebastian Maniscalco. Yep.
Maniscalco. Okay. So
Yep.
there are so many reasons that I love this photo that we'll kind of get into as we go through, but I always like to start with the more technical stuff. I'm assuming, first of all, what body did you shoot these with?
This was taken with a Hasselblad 60 digital body, a 50 megapixel. I think it was a 60-50C.
Okay. And do you know what lens this was?
Yes. I did this actually two different ways, but one was the 80. I love to work with a standard lens on any camera, just called the normal lens. And I also had a zoom that I was floating back and forth with. I think it was the 15-35, or maybe it's the 15-90.
Okay. So clearly studio shoot. White
Clearly.
balance set to manual, or do you manually set your white balance? I mean,
I
balance set to auto, or do you manually set it?
I manually set it.
Okay. What would you have set it at here? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I typically like to keep everything right dead in the middle. And, I find in many cases, depending on a person's skin tone, I'm either going to stay true to it in post, or I might change it a little bit if they've had too much sun. But I try to keep it right in the middle.
Okay. Do you know what your exposure was on these?
I do. This was about, I tend to, when I'm shooting flash, 125, and these, I love to stay in the middle of the lens when I can. So these were about f11.
And what about ISO?
Always 200 when I can.
Okay, so 200 ISO, one 125th, and f11. So, okay, couple questions. The f11 makes total sense to me.
Yep.
The 200 makes sense to me. The 125th, especially when you look at this shot, there's clearly movement. Like I don't believe that he got, especially that back right or the back left, the far back corners. I don't believe that he like froze that way to make sure there was no motion blur, and all of these are tack, right?
Yep.
Do you worry that the 125th was not fast enough ever?
No, because I tend to keep my flash units. I don't run them at full power, so I tend to leave them at, as light as I can keep them. Half power if I can get away with it, and the freeze flash is plenty enough. I mean, even when somebody's dancing, I might go to 160, but I tend to keep my flash units just powered low.
Okay, that makes sense. So before we dive into how you made this thing and your story of this shot, for those of you that are on the audio feed, I'm going to try and describe this to you, but understand there's 9 photos in this one photo, right? So it's a 9-shot horizontal composite of the comedian Sebastian Maniscalco. And when I say it's a horizontal shot, this is a pano of an extreme ratio. I measured it, and it's roughly 265-1 on the ratio. And that's part of what makes it work to me. It's all on a white background. He's wearing the exact same tux in each shot with, like a black tux with a white shirt and a black bow tie. And he is doing in each individual image, he's doing, I don't even want to call it a pose, but it's almost like action. I'll get into that in a second here. Each pose it's expressive. They're bold, right? And the first thing I notice when I look at this shot, and part of the reason I love it, is the balance. There's 9 shots, one center shot that's super close to us, and his position and his angle, he's turned slightly sideways, squatted down, one hand out in front. His eyes are big, wide open. He's looking right down the barrel of the lens, and that sets the stage for this. And then each shot, so to his left and right is another shot where I'm going to say he's smaller. He's not, but they are back farther. And the first thought that hit me when I saw this, picture this if you're driving in your car right now, was picture the Air Force, and a squadron of planes don't fly all on the same horizontal plane, right? You have a front man and then they angle back like an arrow or a wing. And that's what this is doing to me. And it adds power to this shot that I just absolutely dig, because as they go back, each shot of him gets perspectively smaller. He's not smaller, but perspective-wise, he's smaller. Each pose is different, and those poses are key, with that center one being the biggest, looking right at us, eyes wide. But then left and right, he's also kind of less standing up. So by the time you get to those far back shots, there's the two right behind him there, he's standing more, but then he starts squatting more and more and more. And so that accentuates that distance and perspective view. So at the back, he's really, really squatting. And each individual image of Sebastian slightly overlaps the one behind it. It can be a hand, it can be a foot, it can be a knee, it could be an elbow or a head, but not overly done, which is brilliant, right? These aren't so close. There's white space in between them. And because his poses are different, to me, the lighting here is so important. Like if one of those shots, 3 shots back, the shadows didn't match the guy in the front, that would kill me. They all blend and match here. The lighting, the color. There are shadows under his feet. Sometimes it's just a foot, depending on how far his foot is on or off the ground. Other times it's more an entire body shadow. Here's the thing. The expressions that I get remind me, they feel like he's mid stand-up. So from this combination of 9 shots, I actually feel like I know what his act would be like. And that to me is so important. You said early on that when you take a shot, you have a story for every shot you take, I think is the way you worded it.
Yes.
And there's a story here. There's 9 individual photos of Sebastian. It's 9 individual stories, but it's not, right? The reason I think this is such a brilliant multi-shot portrait composite is because these perfectly assemble to make a unified singular story. That's the way I interpret it. Did I miss anything in describing this?
You hit it right on the head when you said it was his act, because that's exactly, Steve, what I asked him to do. Whenever I photograph somebody, it's always good for me to do my research, watch them, listen to their music, watch their stand up. And, Sebastian is really expressive. And, I've seen him live numerous times way before I photographed him. And his hands are great. His body language is great. His feet are great. So essentially, we did a couple of different setups on this shoot. But when we got to this point, I almost let him loose, and just let him go and started to just tell me stories. And I started to get him more excited. And as he got into it, it was literally, he gave me a one-man comedy show.
Hold on. You mean he really literally was, he wasn't just doing these as poses. He was literally telling you, doing an act.
One story after the next. And, when you talked about wanting to be over my shoulder, Steve, I was dying. Thank God for autofocus today, because every single thing he said, I was laughing, tearful laughing. He's, I told him I was Italian, he's Italian. We got into all of that stuff with his dad and my mother and my family. But he really started to talk about, the extremes. Did he really do that? And, oh my God, why would you do that? And I kept egging him on, to keep going and going. And, this image has 9 frames in it. But when I tell you I could have made this with 50, there were that many great images. And basically he just stood on that white backdrop and went at it. And I said, just kind of act as if there's an audience. Don't look at me all the time. Look out as if you're addressing that side. Because I kind of had it mapped out in my mind a little bit. I like to do these composites, and I've done plenty of them. They're not always the same. They're not always the same uh, they're not always the same composition, but this kind of goes back to this is almost a modern day contact sheet if you think about it, Steve.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
fortunate. I was fortunate enough to shoot film, and I still do take a film camera with me every time, an old medium format Pentax 6x7, and it's more of a conversation starter than it is anything. But I would love back in the film days to shoot a contact sheet, look at the film, and I'd print the whole contact sheet. I mean, I've got plenty of them hanging in my house of, Gilbert Gottfried and different people that, gave me one crazy expression. I just print the whole contact sheet 16 by 20, and they're fantastic. So this is kind of a modern day contact sheet, if you think about it, because it's really hard when you have a subject as good as Sebastian to use one image. He's just, every picture's great. So if you want to tell kind of a story for me about who he is, this is the best way to do it. Or print a contact sheet, but this is kind of a modern day contact sheet, really.
I'm intrigued by shots like this on a number of levels. One of them is that planning point of view. And you made the comment that you kind of had this vision in your mind ahead of time. So when you say that, you mean you kind of knew that you might do a composite or were going to do a composite of multiple images. Did he know that?
I'm pretty sure somewhere in the middle I had said I might thread these together because there's so many good ones. I knew I wanted to do a composite like this because I've done so many. Sometimes there's only 3 images, sometimes there's 6. It's just, to me, how it pieces together. But I was sketching and doodling before. I always kind of make a shot list. A musician will make a set list, and
Right.
sometimes I'll do a shot list and, got to get this, hope to get that. If I get all of those, and let's try this. And another thing that I love to talk about is, a photo shoot to me is almost like getting on a roller coaster. You start and you try to get something going, and here comes the car, it's going up the hill, and you're starting to get some good action and energy from your subject. And then all of a sudden you're right up here and it's just boiling. Everything's great. Every picture's good. And then it starts to go back downhill and the shoot's over, right? This was at the top of the roller coaster, no question. He was going crazy, and I was just, every shot, how when you get it, just every shot was great.
So you made the comment you could have done 50, which begs the question then, what made you choose 9 instead of 5, instead of 3? What was your, when you're assembling this, what made you pick 9?
I think it started with probably 20 and narrow it down. I think real estate, Steve, that's probably a good choice of words, is, if you're going to put a composite of even more than 9, 15, 20, if somebody's looking at that picture on your website on a phone, you're
Right.
done, so for me, and if you were going to hang this in your house, it better be awfully big too. So I think a lot of it has to do with, for me, it started obviously with the poses that I felt fit together best. But I think a lot of it had to do with real estate too. It's just, I didn't want him to be too small where you couldn't see every expression and the brilliance behind all of his features, and his everything he did.
And the other reason this works is because you didn't oversaturate him in it. There is, in this case, this phrase actually fits, but you can use this on any kind of graphic design term. There's white space, right? There is room for each individual image to breathe its own life. And again, the perspective on this, the varied poses add layers of interest, right? And then what a lot of people would have done, I think, I guess I can't speak for other people, but I can imagine other people trying to assemble something like this and thinking, okay, well, the feet need to be on the same horizontal plane, which would have hurt the shot. The fact that his feet rise as they go back adds to the perspective of the room that these 9 people are supposedly in and adds to that feeling. But then the back one's not reaching the head height of the front one. All of this three-dimensional layering really works. When you're setting this up and he's doing his act and you're kind of in post and you're assembling it, right? There's 9 different, I don't want to call them poses, but I'm going to. They're not poses, right? He's moving in real life, but I'm going to call them, poses.
Moments.
Moments. That's a better way to term it. Thank you.
Yeah.
What went into in your head? Because I actually think this is critical because of those last 2, right? So the first 2 after the middle one, he's mostly standing, which is good because that allows it to get close to that middle one's height so that you can get the right taper. If he'd been squatting in all of them, that would have gone away. But so as you're assembling this, is that what's going through your head as you're assembling which pose where? Because I can see 9 layers in Photoshop being switched around going, nope, not there, not there. What was your thought process?
What looks good? I tend, Steve, not to overthink it too much. I mean, sometimes so many things could be wrong in a picture that I know that the viewer doesn't know, and it moves me and it feels good, so I go with it. This to me is, what feels right. Oh, that hand's not right. It's more like just putting a graphic or it's really
Graphic
just
design.
what feels. Yeah, it's nothing more than, obviously you don't want the same pose twice. I was very concerned about this, that I didn't want them all looking at the camera, even though that I'm very much, that's kind of my thing. I tend, when I'm photographing, I tend to try to ask the viewer to look in the lens, because I just feel like, there's that connection. It's just part of my work. I don't tend to have a lot of pictures people looking away, because I want them to look right in the viewer's eyes. But in this case, I felt like it's got to be almost like a song, right? If you look at this, and that's really, for me, when I look at this picture, it's funny. I see it. It takes me right back to the laughter, and as much as people look at it and love the composition, I mean, this is who he is. He's just really great when it comes to expressing, whether it's craziness in people's lives or he's just, a great personality. If you look closely, his feet are good, his hands are good. A lot of people can't put that whole combination together, especially with his facial expressions. Oh my gosh. He can really give you.
Like you say, his feet, he is expressive head to toe. Was this by the way, was this a white background or a cyc wall?
Oh no, white background. It was a 12-foot wide white background. Yes.
Like normal paper coming down on the ground.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So shooting against white, obviously lighting really matters here, right? If somebody wanted to try shooting on white, a basic version of this, first of all, what is your lighting setup here?
I think I was looking back at my shot notes on this, and this is like 4 lights. Obviously, lights to light the white, but I tend to, I like to use a deep beauty dish. I actually call it a parabolics, which is a really wonderful, very deep focused, like it's a 45-inch beauty dish, but it's so much more than a beauty dish. And then I will add some supplementary light to that as well. I'm not, as you could probably tell when you look at my work, I don't like soft, flat light. I'm much more of a contrastier, harder light. I just think it's part of the bold quality of what I like to do. And so when I'm shooting somebody, like in this case, obviously the lighting had to be consistent, but there's still some direct light going on here. And I remember we plastered the floor with silver blankets, so there's a lot of bounce light coming up off the floor as well.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so your key light from judging off the first shot the second shot to the right, and the next to the last shot on the right. I'm guessing that your key light, almost Rembrandtish in that it's probably not quite 45 degrees to the right, a little bit above eye level. Is that about right?
Perfect. You have it exactly right. And
Okay.
the reason for that, Steve, is because if that light is too dramatic or too far to one side, then your image where he turns away from the light, it's not going to work. So
Right.
I'm not going to shoot flash on camera. It's not my style. However, if you're going to do something like this, you better make sure that your light has a personality. But if he turns way to the left or way to the right, it will still work.
Okay. And that actually is a good tip for people who want to start trying a multi-shot portrait type composite. That's a good tip for that. And that is make sure that if they turn, the lighting works on any way that they turn. But there is one problem with shooting on white like this, especially when you've got 4 lights, probably 2 on the backdrop, maybe a key. Was the 4th light left of him, or
No,
right of
they
him,
were
left
both
of camera?
Left of camera. So the main light is just to the left of camera, and the other light is kind of a combination. Call it, I don't want to say bounce off the ceiling, but it's just supplementing and softening the shadows off of the parabolics light, I will call it.
Okay,
So
along with the
2 in the
silver
front.
blankets.
Yeah, 2 lights in the front. And then, like I said, for me, depending on the silver you use, sometimes I'll use a mirror. But as you know, silver, bright silver, shiny silver can really act as an additional light. It's kind of like, as you know what it can do, whether it's a fill or off the floor, or bouncing into it on the ceiling, which sometimes I'll do. It's kind of saved my life many, many times.
How far in front of the backdrop is he? Because one of the issues with a white backdrop, obviously, is bleed coming off of that backdrop and wrapping around him. So how are you controlling that? Is it just his distance?
I would say 6 feet. Yeah. And I tend to put black curtains or black backers to prevent that from happening. But for me, when I shoot on white, I like to try to keep them as separate entities. For the same reason you said, I don't like when it wraps around. Some people love that. But for me, I want the back to be the back and the front to be the front. And the only way to control that is to try, if you can, to keep your subject as far away from it and to prevent as much spill or flare coming around as you can.
Okay. So when you're in post, what are your apps of choice?
Pretty much Photoshop. Pretty much. I tend to, I will use Bridge and things to edit, but I'm a Photoshop person.
Okay. And when you're doing composites like this thing, there's overlapping areas. And that's where I see people, like when I do image competitions and shots come up sometimes that I have to judge. And it's like, people, there's no shortcut to zooming in Photoshop to make sure that your masks are right. Is there a key that you would share with people to get better overlapping areas in a composite like this?
Not really. I think that, again, if you're careful, and I work with a lot of post-production people as well, depending on if there's something that I can't do or feel like it's done right, or in many cases, a client, Steve, will have, I will do a shoot for a client, and the client will clearly say, we have our own in-house post people. That's always a tricky thing because, you lose control in some cases. Again, trying to be nice, I will usually ask, hey, can you share with me the steps that go along the way in case I have an opinion? And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But in many cases in the world we live today, if you're working for a Warner Brothers or an HBO, they have their own in-house people, and you can't wrestle away the post from them. You go in knowing somebody else is taking it from you. But for the most part, they do a great job. It might not be exactly how I do it, but
The end result is what matters. Did you edit this one or did somebody else?
oh, I edited it. And the
So
thing is, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
What I was going to say was back in the day, uh, I was I remember the days going back to film, Steve, that we would um, do this type of work on film where we would have the studio dark and I would pop the flash, leave the lens open, cover it, pop it again. So, and you'd get almost the same, you weren't able to tell exactly where you would end up, but you could do 3, 4, 5 images on one piece of film. And sometimes it was brilliant. You'd have to do it. It was much harder to do, but I've been kind of working in this vernacular for a long time, and it's for the right thing, it's really fun to do.
So when you have 9 shots like this, I've seen 2 different schools of thought.
Yes,
Some people will basically edit, color correct each individual in the 9 shots, assemble them together, and then tweak it from there. And I know other people who, no, they all came out of the same camera, the same shoot, the same raw. I'm going to assemble them first and do my color correction, etc., as the end composited result. Do you edit each individual photo, then assemble and edit more, or do you mainly assemble and then do most of your color and edit after?
I would say both. I start and make sure the color is exactly how I want it. And then once the image is together, I will look at it and tweak it if I need to. Another thing that I've been doing quite a bit lately is finishing a picture, Steve, and walking away from it. And
Oh,
sometimes, meaning it's almost like wine, you let it sit and it's going to open up and get better. I have learned in the last few years for me, I will like a picture, or I won't like a picture, or I'll make an initial select and leave it and just get away from it for a day, a week, whatever it is, if I have that luxury. And I come back and, oh my gosh, I can't believe I chose that. Oh my gosh, I didn't like that one at all. And now I like it. So I tend to pay so much more attention to that part of it than the technical. Um, but it's really helped me immensely, I think, with my vision is to, if I've got time to turn in my selects or my picks, I'll take that time. I might immediately
right.
sit down and do that knee jerk, oh, these 5 look great, but then come back to it and come back to it again, sometimes 3, 4, 5 times.
Very similar. A lot of times I'll edit a shoot, and before I send them to anybody, I'll go out and I'll have a glass of whiskey or something, or I'll talk to my wife for a little bit. I'll have her come back in and kind of go through them with me. And inevitably, the second time I go through, after even just 30 minutes in between, it's like, those highlights aren't right. Just the littlest things from a 30-minute difference, because I'm not sitting in front of these screens for a little bit. My eyes change, and I find that to be refreshing. So I'm guessing that these shadows under his feet were added in post. Is that correct?
Yes and no. One of the qualities of that light I was speaking to you about, I'll call it a beauty dish, parabolics, is, I love to see a shadow on white. Um, so I won't blow my background out enough, or I will make sure that my main light gives me some shadow, because in a picture like this, I think the subject has to feel grounded. And if I were to blow out the background or overfill this shot, he's floating and it doesn't feel as good to me. So I've always
Right.
been a shadow guy, whether it's on gray, light gray, white. I like to keep the shadows. I think it grounds the person, whether it's a single shot or a multiple.
So what might you have done to these shots in post?
They're mostly cleanup, because he does not need, if you look at him, he's a handsome guy. A lot of this is left as is. If there's anything, it would be making some bigger, some smaller, but that was a crisp tuxedo, and I remember most of his hair was great. In this particular case, these did not need much, especially on their own, and
Interesting.
I think it's more of just the composition that was the challenge here, was the composition and selecting from so many great images of him.
Well, I, again, can't stress it enough. Love this shot. So well done, so well assembled and thought out. Tells that story where I feel like I know I've never seen him live, but I feel like I know that I understand his routine a little bit from looking at this. So again, thank you so much for sharing how you made this.
No problem.
I want to switch gears. Before we finish up, I want to do a speed round. Now, when I say speed round, I'm going to ask you a question. Whatever pops into your head, you go with it.
Yep.
Okay. So speed round question number 1. Top portrait photography tip.
Capture the soul of your subject. Find out who they are. Just try to get underneath their skin.
Top white background tip.
Don't overlight it. Even though it's on white, don't overlight it.
Biggest photo mistake you made or almost made?
Paying too much attention to the technical and missing what was right in front of me.
Wow, that's a good one. Okay. Favorite composition rule if you have one?
Think outside the box when cropping. That's something I challenge myself with all the time is don't crop it like you think it should be. Try to zoom in and cut the top of the head off, maybe take the shoulder, move it to the right, move it to the left. You might find some real magic in a unusual or less expected crop.
It's funny you mentioned that because I am one of those people that firmly believe a single photo can literally be completely different multiple photos simply by changing a crop. And people tend to just, I know people who won't change the default ratio or whatever the reasoning is. And literally by just changing a crop, you change the story. It's by if you choose an 85 1.2 versus a 200 versus a 10, you're changing the crop, right? And you understand very clearly that changes the story that you're telling. But for some reason, when you're using a mouse, people lose that idea, and it's the same thing. Favorite band or performer?
Oh, so many. I guess it would depend on the genre, but the first one that comes to mind for me is the Foo Fighters.
Oh, good. Fantastic
Dave
live,
Grohl.
fun to photograph.
Yeah.
Favorite drink?
Oh, tequila.
Okay, which I was hoping you'd say that. Because on your About page, you mention sampling tequila. Do you have a favorite?
I actually have a tequila bar in my home. So with over 200 bottles on the wall. And so I've been to Mexico so many times and actually been to the town of Tequila and been to distilleries. That's a whole nother podcast, Steve. But I've been fortunate to get to know some great people who have been in that world for 30 years. There are so many great brands that are on the market today, not the ones you'd expect. But as far as do I have a favorite, it depends on the expression, because as you know, there's Blanco, Reposado, Añejo, Extra Añejo. So that, again, is such a multi-tiered question, but I tend to like a really great Reposado.
Okay. I'm probably the same. I am a whiskey person, so I have about 180 bottles of whiskey, 180, 185 bottles of whiskey. And I do on my radio show every Sunday, I do a whiskey pick.
Yeah.
I call it an adult beverage pick, K-Cal on the rocks. It's an adult beverage pick. It's usually a whiskey, on occasion something else. And I actually picked a tequila one time that I love if you've never had it. Coscanes. Coscanes has a number 10 still strength, still proof tequila. That it's a Blanco, but it's 107 proof, and it's fantastic if you ever get the chance to try it.
I have not only tried it, I'm very familiar with the distillery, and it is a wonderful brand. It's a great brand. And that high proof Blanco is fantastic.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Favorite movie or TV show?
Forrest Gump for me. I feel like if I would have made my own movie, it would have been a Forrest Gump kind of movie. Because I feel like the emotion and the roller coaster ride in that film was, if I made a movie, that's how it would feel.
So, final question. Is there
I have to add Curb Your Enthusiasm to it.
Oh, yes.
I am a huge Larry David fan, and there's not an episode where I don't laugh out loud. Big fan of that show.
It's funny because, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, a huge Seinfeld fan. I've photographed him. I have the book. I've got the box set, all of that stuff. Huge Larry David fan. And yet, for some reason, we had not watched Curb. And we just started maybe a month before recording this. We're one episode away from finishing season 3. And it's everything I want in a TV show. It's everything I love in Seinfeld, plus no censorship. There's so much brilliance in that show.
Love it.
Last question. Is there any photographer out there today that you think more people should know about?
There's several, but I'm going to say Reuven Afanador. Reuven is very well known in the fashion world, but he's also a brilliant portrait photographer, and his work is just so full of soul and beauty and composition. And there's not a ton of photographers that I am huge fans of, because it's hard to stand up to Irving Penn and Richard Avedon. I mean, there's certainly more than a handful that I like working today, but Reuven's work for me it's otherworldly. It's so nice.
So, reminder to everybody, there's a small gallery of work that you can see at the website. All the links that we talk about are at the website behindtheshot.tv. And Paul, if people want to connect with you, I just had your website up for those of you that are watching on video, but for those on the audio feed, if people want to find you, what's your website?
It's Paul Mobley Studio, pretty much across the board. I'm mostly an Instagram guy. That's where I put most of my focus, and try to really keep track of the work, my regular work. But it's Paul Mobley Studio.
Okay. PaulMobleyStudio.com, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Paul Mobley Studio. Twitter/X, depending on how you want to call it, it's at Paul Shoots. And again, Paul, thank you so much for doing this, man. I really appreciate your time.
Steve, I appreciate you getting the word out on photography, and thank you so much for having me. It's always great to talk about the work.
Again, if you like this show, if you're on YouTube, please head down, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, whatever you need to do. And if you want to find any past episodes or read the blog post that I wrote about Paul, head over to the website. It's behindtheshot.tv. If you want to follow me, my website, my portfolio is stevebrazill.com. It's like the country Brazil, but 2 L's. And of course, on socials, pretty much anywhere, Mastodon, Blue Sky, X, Instagram, it's at Steve Brazill. On Facebook, it's at Steve Brazill Photography or at Behind the Shot TV. But I'll be honest with you, don't message me on Facebook because I'm never there. I pretty much don't use Facebook anymore. Again, thank you to my guest, Paul Mobley. Join us next time as we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind the shot.